someone who might be able to elucidate the sort of mindset of the BBC is Robin Aitken, because he is author of Can We Trust the BBC? Robin, we know that former BBC executive Danny Cohen has claimed that there's an institutional crisis at the national broadcaster. In fact, last month, a damning report found the BBC had breached its own editorial guidelines more than 1,500 times during the Gaza war. And I must admit, even I used to be at the BBC. I went through the BBC traineeship. I understand that it strives for partiality. But even I'm beginning to find this sort of strange appeasement or almost a fetishization of the Middle Eastern struggle at large, rather unbecoming. Am I being hypersensitive?
Hi, Alex. Not at all. I mean, I think this is what happens when you're locked inside your ideological bubble. I mean, this is the point about the BBC. The BBC imagines itself, and some people within it strive very hard, as you say, to be impartial. But the trouble is, they don't see themselves as having an ideological viewpoint. Now, when I worked at the BBC, it became very clear to me that the BBC does have a consistent, coherent, and very clear worldview. And this thing about Hezbollah and Hamas, the problem is that the BBC is locked into a way of thinking which selects the victim status that it's going to champion. And so many years ago, it decided that the Palestinians, I beg your pardon, were the victims in all this. And because of that, they give, I think, undue weight to the opinions of, for instance, the Hamas Health Authority. I mean, let's be honest. How reliable do you think the death toll figures released by the Hamas Health Authority are? I mean, really.
Right, but they don't even say the Hamas Health Authority. At one point they said these figures, of course it's controlled by Hamas. They now just talk about the Palestinian Health Authority. They've actually kind of reverted back to where they started and got criticised for.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the point is that those figures, they have every reason to exaggerate and distort those figures. I don't believe for a moment that we've got an accurate figure for the number of deaths that there have so far been in Gaza. And I think, this idea of, talk about niche broadcasting the Ayatollah for 40 minutes this morning must have been slightly baffling, I would think, for whatever remains of the BBC's audience at that time of day. I mean, the more sensible approach, clearly, in my view, would have been for someone to closely monitor what he was saying and to have picked out the guts of it and provide a useful clip for news bulletins. I cannot see, for the life of me, why you would want to see old Beardy talking for 40 minutes. I really can't.
Well, no, to me, like I said, it's fetishising what is, in many respects, a hostile regime run by a mad Ayatollah who hates the West and talks about the destruction of the West. But I'm increasingly finding, especially with the Today programme, I must admit, because I listen to it every day, that is part of my DNA now, It's having sort of gone to journalism school where we were always told at Cardiff, you should tune into the Today programme, it's agenda setting. It's rather like a junkie. I have to go and get my fix every morning, even if it's making me feel quite ill. And so I do. And I often find now, when it comes to this, there is a few things that are going on here. There is increasingly platforming of voices which sort of casually represent at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning the sort of more extreme ideologically driven side of Middle Eastern, theocratic politics. I just sort of casually play that, Israel's genocidal, Israel's aggression. And that's just being broadcast in a way that they would never have permitted the Taliban or ISIS or Al-Qaeda to get away with. Then at the same time, actually saying the word Taliban has just made it pop into my head. There seems to now be this sort of weird trend with the radio broadcasters in particular to say everything emanating from the Middle East in a strange hammed-up Middle Eastern accent. They don't seem to say, President Xi Jinping of China, but they all go Taliban, Qatar. What's going on there?
As you know, Alex, or maybe you don't know, but I was a Today reporter, actually, in my final incarnation at the BBC, and I worked for the great Rod Liddell, who was a joy to work for. And I must say, now, you might say, well, here's an old bloke talking about the good old days. But I do believe that we had better standards back then. And, I'd been in the BBC by a quarter of a century by that point, and I had seen those standards slip over the period of time I was there. I mean, the reason I left the BBC was because I became thoroughly disenchanted with this constant lie that they give us that, that it's an impartial broadcasting organisation. Is there anyone out there who still buys that? I really can't believe that there is. Or if there are, they need to open their eyes about what the reality is.
Yeah, Robin, I was in the BBC for about 6 months. That's when I was in their special sort of, internationally reputed talent scheme. I was one of the chosen few. There were 10 of us being fast-tracked through the system, and I managed 6 months before I went, I don't like it here.
No, it's, this is a very, just to go back to what I said at first, the problem in the BBC is that BBC people genuinely believe, I think, that they don't have a political viewpoint. They think that the views which they do hold are in some way politically neutral. And that's that's like going to a political conference and saying, this is great, everyone believes me, everyone agrees with me. And that's how it is in the BBC. There is nobody really taking a contrary viewpoint. When you go into it's a few years since I worked in a BBC newsroom, but even back then, it was a political monoculture. Yeah. You could not have raised a cricket team of Tories from the entire BBC news department, I wouldn't have thought. I mean, I used to make a point, because it was so much fun and because Rod used to encourage mischief. I used to say outrageous things just for the joy of seeing jaws drop when you said something unforgivably un-PC. It was just great fun.
Oh, Robin, I used to do that. Do you know, that was literally my favourite game in morning meetings at BBC Wales. I'd think, let's talk about something that's going to horrify everybody.
Yeah. You know what the real trick is, Alex? If you pick up on the Daily Mail's front page, that's what really gets them going.
Yeah, the canteen at BBC Wales back then, when it was in Llandaff, you walked in and there was this sort of big stand outside with just the Guardian newspaper, and I thought, yeah, that's about right. But do you think that actually some of the financial decisions that have been taken with the restructuring of the corporations adding into this, and from that, I mean that when you look at it, of course, we all pay the licence fee, and this funds the BBC. It does use advertising and selling programmes and stuff internationally as well as part of its revenue. But when you look at the restructuring, when they realised they had to tighten their belt, they did, to me, what I think is the unthinkable, which is they took BBC News, which is the sort of, when it comes to public service broadcasting, surely the national rolling news channel is the thing that you would keep. And instead they said, we're going to merge this with BBC World. So instead, if you turn on the BBC News channel now, which might explain why you had the Ayatollah for 40 minutes, you instead have a load of reporters and news anchors from different countries, different ethnicities and some with different accents, reporting on global news affairs and not British news affairs. When you go into Broadcasting House, you can see BBC Persia, BBC this, BBC that, BBC the other. And whilst a lot of governments, a lot of countries and state-run broadcasters have decided to really push the international arm, looking at the soft diplomacy, the soft power that having something like the BBC has traditionally had globally. Al Jazeera, France 24, Russia Today, CGT, whatever they call it, the Chinese one, actually still maintain a very strong national instinct about them. I fear that the BBC, in their effort to sort of, upkeep the international arm of the corporation, has dropped to the very first B. It doesn't seem British anymore.
Yeah, well, I think you make a very good point. I think that is, you put your finger on it there. And I think it explains partly the reason why the BBC was so really disgracefully partisan during the Brexit debates, because the BBC instinctively took the role of champion of the EU. And there is an organisation which has monitored the BBC for many years, particularly on the Brexit issue. And its figures, which are clearly easily found online, show that over a period of decades, the bias against the Leave side of things was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, you're talking, sort of 95 to 1. 95% of the coverage was given to people who wanted to remain or expand or deepen our links with the EU. And I think that is because the BBC instinctively feels itself to be an international organisation. It's rather like the kind of UN of broadcasting. And that is not actually what the BBC should be. The BBC actually, as you say, the BBC ought to be more upfront about identifying with us as a nation and also sticking up for us as a nation and our way of life, instead of always taking the part of the foreigner. I say that, in one sense, it's kind of noble in a way. You say I wrote this book, Can We Trust the BBC? That was a long time ago. I have a second book out, published in 2020, which was The Noble Liar, which is a much better book, and which actually examines in much greater detail the BBC and what it has done and its biases and the way they've affected us. And I think that the BBC always thinks of itself as being on the right side of the argument. It cannot conceive of itself as being in the wrong or as in some way espousing policies or ideas which are harmful. No. It cannot conceive of such a thing. I
couldn't agree more, Robin. I could talk to you all day about this. And we should go for a drink one day and share some of our traumas. We can sort of, a bit like having group therapy together.